Dead Russell. Part 1. The beginning of the legend. The Forgotten Forest has long been considered a sacred place. Old-timers say that their ancestors believed that it was from this forest that everything began. It was from here that the forest began to expand in all directions. It was called the heart of the forest, and no one dared to touch it. It was said to contain the power of nature, which protects and punishes at the same time. In the early 20th century, when wood became a particularly valuable resource, a group of loggers decided to cut down trees in the Forgotten Forest. Their actions were intended to clear the area for construction, and they did not pay attention to the warnings of the old-timers. People tried to dissuade them, saying that this forest is alive and has its own will. But the loggers just laughed, thinking it was a fairy tale. They set out with axes and saws, determined to fulfill their plans. When the men began to cut the trees, the forest immediately changed. Suddenly, all sounds became silent, and even the wind, which had always been walking between the trees, stopped moving. The forest was filled with heavy, pressurizing air, and even the sun could not penetrate the dense crown. By morning, the group of loggers had disappeared. People from neighboring villages gathered a search party. When they approached the forest, they saw that only a few axes were lying near the tree trunks, and the trees were intact. The axes were covered with moss and fused with the trees, as if they had been there for centuries. The old people realized that the forces of nature were angry. The forest took revenge on the loggers for their greed. Since then, the Forgotten Forest has been called a place that never forgives. All those who dared to go there disappeared forever, leaving behind only an ominous rustle in the tree crowns. Legend has it that if you listen closely, you can hear the screams of those whom the forest has taken with it. Locals began to build chapels along the borders of the forest, leaving offerings to appease its anger. People forbade even approaching this place, especially children. But time passed, and a new generation began to doubt the old legends. It was then that a group of young people decided to break the ban and check whether the forest was really as dangerous as they say. Part 2. Young Adventurers. A group of friends, Lily, Adam, Emily, Ashley, and Austin, were always looking for adventure. They often gathered together to explore abandoned places or play role-playing games with a spooky plot. So, when they heard the legend of the Forgotten Forest, they decided it was a great opportunity to test their nerves. They ignored the warnings of local old-timers. "We're not in a horror movie, we're in real life," Austin joked. "Even if there is something out there, we'll definitely find a way to solve this mystery," Adam encouraged. All of them were confident in their courage, as they had encountered scary stories in their favorite computer games. The friends carefully prepared for the hike. They packed their backpacks with provisions, lanterns, lots of rope, maps, and walkie-talkies. On a sunny morning, they set off for the forest without telling anyone so that they wouldn't be dissuaded from their plan. Instead, they wrote a note describing their plans. At first, everything seemed quite ordinary. The forest was full of life. A light breeze rustled the leaves, and birdsong added a sense of comfort. The friends laughed, told jokes, and felt confident. But an hour later, something happened that they could not have expected. The path they had just walked disappeared. All that was left behind was a dense forest that they could not recognize. Instead of the familiar path they had been walking on, tall trees and bushes that had not been there before appeared behind them. This must be some kind of humorous anomaly of nature. Ashley tried to joke, although he sounded nervous. "Does that happen?" Lily asked, clutching the map in her hands. "We were definitely going that way, weren't we?" Everyone remained silent, but a sense of anxiety was already rising in each of them. The friends tried to understand what was happening, but no one could give a rational explanation. Then Austin suggested tying ribbons on the branches and making notches in the trees, as he had seen in one of the movies, which the hero used to get back. Austin's words cheered everyone up, and the friends enthusiastically started doing it. Their spirits were up, and they were sure that this would solve their problem of orientation. And everyone continued to move forward with confidence. Part 3. Vanishing Landmarks. The hours slowly flowed into each other, merging into an endless chain of monotony. The friends, who were initially confident in their route, gradually began to lose their footing. The forest seemed alive. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks identical to the slightest scratch, their branches intertwined in bizarre patterns, and their roots entangled the ground, creating traps for their feet. The map they had used at the beginning of the route had become useless, and even the compass they had taken with them on the journey had stopped working. Its arrows were moving in different directions, as if an invisible force was pulling them in different directions. What's going on? I don't understand anything. You see, it's like a computer game. Wherever we move, the trees are all the same. The roots are all the same. Everything is the same. Lily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Wait, we have to go back, said Ashley, who had always been calm. His words sounded sharp, almost commanding. Look for the signs we left behind, he said. Everyone agreed, and they started searching. However, the traces they left behind seemed to have disappeared. The ribbons were untied and disappeared without a trace. The notches on the bark had somehow become smooth and clean, as if they had been erased by someone's invisible hand. Adam, who had always tried to find a logical explanation, became increasingly irritated. It's definitely one of us. Are you kidding? He barked, looking back at his friends. But his companions' faces were as surprised and frightened as his own. No one's joking, Adam, Emily said quietly, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. There's something wrong here. And indeed, with every step they took, they could feel the atmosphere getting heavier. The air was getting thicker, as if it was being saturated with something invisible. The sun, which until recently had been illuminating the forest with its warm light, suddenly began to fade. The rays were losing their power, turning a sickly grayish hue, even though it was just approaching noon. Their voices, which used to ring with confidence, now sounded muffled. It seemed that even nature did not want them to communicate. The forest absorbed every sound, turning it into a barely audible whisper. We have to keep going and not stop. If we can't find our way back, we keep moving forward. Sooner or later we'll get out of this forest, Ashley said. They continued to walk forward, hoping that soon they would come across something that would resemble reality. But with every step they took, reality seemed to slip away. The feeling that they had left the world they were used to was getting stronger and stronger. The trees didn't just look the same anymore. They seemed to change their position, blocking the path the friends had just taken. Something is wrong, Lily whispered. She stopped and wrapped her arms around herself, as if this could protect her from an unknown threat. It's the forest, Ashley whispered. It's alive, and it doesn't want to let us out. His words hung in the air, echoing. The forest seemed to gloat at the truth, and ahead of them was something much worse than just disappearing landmarks. Part 4, the first horror. The sun was already hiding behind the horizon, leaving the forest in semi-darkness, and the friends decided to set up camp. Realizing the danger around them, they decided to spend the night together in the same tent. The forest seemed strangely quiet, but this silence was occasionally broken by whisper-like sounds coming from somewhere very close. When everyone fell asleep, Emily heard something strange in her sleep. Her anxiety grew, her heart began to beat with incredible force, and her body clenched tensely, because she heard a baby crying. 1,000 thoughts flew through her mind. However, no matter how scared she was, she could not afford to stay in the tent because it was a child crying. When she came out of the tent, she saw that it was almost pitch black outside, and a thick fog was slowly covering the ground. In this fog, she noticed a fuzzy silhouette that looked like a child. Emily tried to wake her friends, but they were sleeping so soundly that even her loud cries could not wake them. Left alone, Emily decided to approach the child. She turned on the flashlight, but the beam of light only reached the length of her arm. Her heart was beating faster and faster, but the curiosity and pity of the child's cry overcame her fear. Step by step, she moved forward until the crying became so loud that it blocked her thoughts. Finally, she came to the figure of a child who stood with his back to her, and shaking, Emily put her hand on her shoulder. Immediately, her body was shackled by a fierce cold that penetrated her skin to the bone. The baby's crying turned into a piercing scream that pierced her head. Emily felt her body pierced by thousands of sharp branches, and her skin turned to stone. A painful spasm enveloped her, and the world around her plunged into darkness. When she woke up, she saw that she was hanging from the branches of a small tree, as if it was trying to hold her with its cold, strong arms. Her feet barely touched the ground, and it seemed to her that the forest was silently watching her. Gathering the rest of her strength, Emily slid down the tree and staggered back to the tent. Her friends were still asleep. She decided not to wake them up and chalked it up to a hallucination due to fatigue and stress. But her body did not stop shivering, and this coldness remained in her soul even when sleep finally won out. Part 5. The Disappearance of Austin. The next morning, the group woke up early, disturbed by a strange sense of danger. Ashley was the first to notice Austin's disappearance. His backpack was lying open near an old tree with strangely twisted branches hanging from it like skinny arms. There were footprints all around, breaking off as if whoever had left them had simply vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle. Panic quickly gripped everyone. "We need to go back," Ashley said, trying to stay calm. Everyone agreed, but every time they tried to find their way back, they ended up in the same place. It was as if the forest itself was playing tricks on them. No matter which way they went, sooner or later they would return to the clearing where they had set up camp. They began to count their steps and came to the conclusion that the path they were traveling was the same in every direction. Panic overtook them. Logical thoughts left their minds. Only a feeling of hopelessness filled their souls. Once again, trying to find their way, they came across a gruesome sight, a circle of dry, dead trees. In its center lay bones that looked like human bones. A chill ran down their spines as they realized what it could be. "What is it?" Lily whispered, grabbing Ashley's hand. Suddenly, she flinched, opening her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "What?" Adam asked, looking around. "A whisper. He's calling my name," Lily whispered. As if mesmerized, she moved away from the group, ignoring their calls to stop. She stopped only when she pointed to a tree. Lily froze, her gaze sliding over the old tree, and suddenly she saw a face. It was Austin. His features were clearly visible on the bark, as if they had been plucked from his true form. His eyes, full of pain and despair, seemed alive, and his lips seemed to whisper her name, to call her to him. Lily felt a chill run down her spine, and her heart trembled with terror. Her voice trembled. It's Austin. He was calling me." They all ran to the tree she was pointing to, but there was nothing there but ordinary bark. "Lily, it's your imagination. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is caused by the loss of Austin," Adam tried to reassure her. "No, I saw him. He was here. His eyes, his mouth. He was calling for me and begging for help," Lily screamed. Looking around, someone mentioned that Austin had gotten lost before and always found his way back. "Maybe he's home by now," Ashley suggested. But Lily just shook her head. No, it was him. His voice. It was pain. It was fear. Night covered the forest, and the friends, devastated by hopelessness and despair, decided to climb into the tent, which seemed to them to be a thin barrier between them and the forest. That night brought even more eerie sounds and shadows moving between the trees. And the next morning they realized that the forest would not let them go. It was breathing and hearing their every step, and the whisper of the wind between the trees was a mysterious conversation that was being conducted about them. It was ancient and silent, as if it had a will of its own, and it seemed to be watching, deciding their fate.